Monday, 25th December, 1854. This has been a joyful Christmas. Aunt Julia and Uncle Seth arrived around noon Saturday and told all sorts of stories about the journey from Vicksburg. They'll be here through February before they leave in time for planting. Of course they came bearing gifts. A fine volume of Hawthorne for me, a porcelain doll for Caroline, and a stringed puppet for Will. Mother and Father were generous as ever, but I suppose the gift I cherish most is the letter Caroline wrote me. Generally she scribbled her imitation of script, but I can make out her block letters. Dear Teague, I can write big words when Mother spells them for me, so I will write I love you and you are my dear. Love, Caroline. She says she wants to be sharp like me, so she intends to write a letter to me every day. I dare say she'll be sharper. She's starting her writing life 4 years earlier than I did. Father only just came to my room to present me with one more gift. One that I won't say I cherish, but one that has set me thinking on a most unpleasant subject. He gave me a key to his gun cabinet and had a short talk with me. He said the abolitionist activities have died down now that it's cold weather. It doesn't hurt, he said, that some of the men from town rode down to this settlement a couple of weeks ago to let those people know their presence wasn't wanted. But he wants me to be prepared for any retaliation or redoubling of their efforts. He's put a great deal of trust in me, implying my part in defending the family, which deepens the guilt I feel at sneaking down all those evenings to see Gabriel. I had planned to see him tonight, to give him a bite of Christmas dinner, but after talking to Father I can't bear to go. Perhaps I may overcome my shame tomorrow. The doctor's office was on the outskirts of town, where it had been since Dr. Newkirk built it in the community's beginning. Every doctor subsequent to Dr. Newkirk's passing had worked out of that office. There weren't many structures around it, presumably because no one wanted the constant reminder of mortality next door. There was one house, however, situated to the right of the office, and a little further back from the street that had an intimate connection with it. The DePriest house was only a few years old, having been built after the young doctor's realization that he couldn't bring a bride home to Dockery boarding house. It was cozy, more of a cottage really than a house, with green shutters on the windows and a trellis of ivy growing up one end of it. A footpath led from the office to the front door of the house, and an equally worn path continued from the back door to the small garden beyond. John put his hands in his pockets as he walked this path. He may have been telling his father-in-law for these past few days that he was riding with him and Scott into town simply to check on his office, but he had known all along he was really going home. He shouldn't have worried about the condition of the house. Sam Etheridge was as fine a tenant as he was an apprentice. He just wasn't a gardener. Not that John expected much from the first week of April, but if Rebecca were able to take care of her little flower beds, he was sure the place would have some color now, instead of the drab brown and black that filled the garden. Rebecca had been so proud of this little house when he showed it to her. It was not at all like Oakshade, with at least a dozen rooms and acres upon acres of woodlands and meadows. DePriest House was really not even large enough to deserve to be named. It had 4 small rooms and an attic. It would have fit into one wing of her father's house. John had been so fearful that she would be disappointed, that she would say some hackneyed euphemism for it like, "How quaint," and then run back to her parents to cry over her mistake in accepting his proposal. Instead, she had marveled at the cabinetry in the kitchen and at the whatnot in the tiny parlor, and at how he had been able to carve such intricate patterns in them, let alone build the house and carry on his medical practice without slowing. She loved best the window in her kitchen that looked out on her garden. She had a way of picking such an array of plants that something was always in bloom, regardless of the season. John started walking back toward his office now, with his eyes downcast to watch each step that he took. He looked up at the sound of his apprentice's voice inside as he approached the half-open door. Etheridge was telling a joke to someone, and John peeked through the window to see who it was. Sam was holding the forehead of one of the Brighton boys with one hand and a threaded needle with the other. The boy had probably cracked his head open trying to break another of his father's good-byes. Until he had become a doctor and started setting Brighton bones on a regular basis, John had never understood why people spoke of breaking a horse when they were taming it. He stepped up on the porch and tried not to let his boots sound too loudly on the wood planks so as not to startle Sam or the Brighton boy while the gash was being sewn. "Come on in," Etheridge called out. John opened the door the rest of the way and stepped inside. "Good morning, Sam." Sam turned his head to his employer while keeping his hands on his patient's forehead. "Dr. DePriest, I thought you were Oscar Carey. He was supposed to come in today for his, he glanced down at young Brighton. "His pills." "Oh," John said, playing along. "I'll get them ready for him." He came further into the office, but instead of stopping at the medicine case, he headed for a cabinet mounted on the far wall. "There's some coffee on the stove if you want it," Etheridge said. "Sounds good," John replied. He opened the cabinet and drew out a glass container of small white pellets, and then poured some coffee in a cup he had pulled out of the same cabinet. "Have you been to the house?" Sam asked as he recommenced his sewing. "Yes, you've kept it well." John put 24 of the pellets into a vial, and then dropped one into his coffee. "All right, Marcus, I'm done." The boy hopped down off the table. "I want you to come back in a few days so I can take those out. And don't get near that colt again today. You break your neck, and there's not a thing I can do for you." "How long do you think that warning will stick with him?" John asked after the boy had gone. "About a minute. How long do you think Oscar Carey's going to keep buying those things off of you?" Etheridge motioned to the vial. "As long as sugar is cheaper here than it is at the Mercantile." Sam smiled. "So I suppose you and Mrs. DePriest will be coming back home soon?" "No." John turned to put the sugar pills back in the cabinet. The impracticality of the move nailed him to the floors of Oakshade. Mrs. Warner would of course want to attend Rebecca, and Dr. Warner, however competent he thought John in any other case, would never trust him to look after his daughter by himself. And then there was Lucy. Rebecca was in no condition to care for her, and he couldn't stay with them all day and still make a living for them. There was no other way he could think of to manage the situation. He was glad Sam seemed to take the flat tone of his reply as an indication to drop the matter, as the young man began putting his instruments back in their case and said, "I don't suppose you've heard that my brother's getting married?" "Coretta Scott, I expect," John said. "Well, he beat you to the family. You'd better be working a bit harder on Annalee if you want in as well." All the comment Sam would make on that subject was the clearing of his throat. "I put the inventory report in your desk. We'll be needing some more mercury and laudanum soon, so I put in an order on Friday." He hesitated as John sat at his desk. "I also put in for a new syringe." John looked up from the inventory report. "What happened?" "Well, I went out to Oakshade a couple of weeks ago when Mrs. DePriest was having such a hard time. I don't know how much they told you about that." John nodded for him to continue. "They had run out of laudanum, and I was bringing them some more. I went up to see Mrs. DePriest, and I was only there a few minutes before she started having a coughing spell. Some blood was coming up, and it didn't seem like she was going to stop on her own. Of course, I couldn't give her anything orally, so I injected some morphine. She couldn't keep still, so the needle broke off when I was coming back out with it. I got it out, though, after she had calmed down a little." He avoided John's stare. "It was a mess." He thrust his hands into his pockets and stood like a guilty schoolboy. John stood, scraping his chair on the floor, and stepped to the window behind the desk. He had a clear view of Rebecca's plot. He stopped himself at the thought. Why he should think of it as Rebecca's plot was beyond him. It was her garden, he told himself. Thinking of her plot evoked images of a raised grassy area lying to the right of his dead brother-in-law. He clenched his jaw and closed his eyes. "I'm sorry, John," Sam muttered. John turned to him. "We've still got the spare?" Sam blinked. "The spare syringe, yes." "Good." John stepped back to his desk. "I want you to sweep up a little in here. Dr. Warner is bringing a guest in later." He turned a page of the inventory report and looked down to it. He could feel Sam still staring at him from across the room, but he refused to repeat himself. Finally, Etheridge stirred and reached for the broom. John focused on the report, but then realized halfway down the page that he didn't remember anything he had read. His jaw was trembling, probably just from where he had kept it clamped tight for the last several minutes. Nevertheless, it wouldn't do to let Sam see it trembling. "I'll be back in a bit," he said as he moved to the door. If only for a little while, he was going to sit in his own house where no one could interrupt him or pity him or see him if he cried. Tuesday, 3rd April, 1855. I've cried like a child tonight, perhaps because I've acted like one. I wish we had all been born in a different time, in the far distant past when Henry and his people could live unmolested in untouched Africa, or else in the future when, like Gabriel says, men will live together in one accord, in one all-inclusive race. Joe Green came to Father this afternoon with an accusation that Big Henry had sassed him. Of course, Father believed him and didn't even question Big Henry. He had no chance to defend himself despite having been a favorite of Father for as long as I can recall. Father left the punishment to Green's discretion, and I'll be hanged if that man didn't go for the lashing of the old Hebrews, 40-1. I ran to tell Father he was going to excess, but though Father hated to hear it, he said they must learn to afford Green the same respect they afford their master. He couldn't interfere without undermining that respect. By the time I ran back out to the whipping post, Green had finished, and Webb and some of the others were helping Big Henry back to his cabin. Little Henry wouldn't look at me, though I wanted him to know I was sorry, but ran ahead to warn the women to have hot water and rags ready. Webb told me I ought to go back to the house, which I did, but only to fetch the laudanum from Mother's store. Henry was waiting for me at the cabin door when I arrived. He wouldn't accept the laudanum I tried to press on him, and worse, he blocked my entrance to the cabin. I tried to persuade him that I wanted only to help, but he insisted that I turn away. He was acting so strangely. At a time I felt called more for mercy than for pride, and I became angry. "What is wrong with you?" I yelled. "What kind of man do you think I am? Do you imagine for one instant that I can walk away knowing the pain he's in?" Henry stayed calm despite my rage. "I know what kind of man you are, but you can't come in. Go back to the house now." "Don't you say go home like a man to a little boy. Don't you treat me like I'm the slave here. You let me in or I'll make you." Henry still didn't raise his voice, but simply stared at me in disappointment, or in contempt. I deserved both. "No, sir." I couldn't possibly have missed the emphasis on "sir." It was exactly the same emphasis he uses for Joe Green, the kind that to his ears sounds low and servile, but that Henry actually reserves for those men who are in every way beneath him. He backed inside the cabin and shut me out. Whether or not he expected me to follow, I don't know. I know only that those words and his tone struck me as surely as Green's lash had struck Henry's father merely minutes before. I sat down there at the hedge and wept, as Big Henry had not, even with the blood running down his back. I had made myself an enemy, or rather, I had been born an enemy, and had just pulled off the mask of friendship to reveal what I truly am. I am my father's son. His sins are my sins, for all that I have enjoyed the privilege of being born the heir of all I see. I just acknowledged and proven that the ties of blood were stronger for me than any tie of friendship. Hours passed, afternoon became night, and though my tears dried, I still sat staring at the movement behind the cabin curtains, those cast-off pieces of fabric from one of Mother's old dresses. At length the door opened, and out of the dim, candle-lit frame, Henry stepped forth to find me. I watched him silently, or I watched his feet, as I couldn't meet his gaze until he sat beside me, folded his arms, and sighed. "How is he?" I finally dared to ask. "He'll live, fit to work in a couple of days." I moaned at the implication that my concern was merely that of a master, and Henry amended his statement. "I'm sorry." "No, I'm sorry," I cried. "Please forgive me." Though I could not see his features, I could hear a weary smile in his voice. "Better not let your father hear you say that, you great tall jackass." "He would have me admit when I'm a jackass. My father's a good man." "So's mine. This land is full of good men, but—" He was silent for a moment. "What?" "I don't wish to hang for philosophizing." "Henry," I admonished, for there were only we two in the yard. "But what is a good man in an evil world? What is he when he serves that evil? All of us are slaves in such a world, but only some of us know it. I think your Gabriel down at the river is right. War is coming. Blood's the only thing that can cleanse this land, but it won't be a war of God's avenging angels smiting the wicked. It'll be a war of men, same as it's always been. Good men and evil men killing and dying right alongside each other. The only difference is the good men will have more to lose." "I pray God you're wrong," I answered. "Pray all you like, Teague. I'll pray too. But men have a way of following their own will and saying it's God's. Alabama is proof enough of that." "How did we ever get to such a place?" "Same as how we get to any place. Carried at first, and then on our own 2 feet. God never damned anybody. We damn ourselves, every last one of us." "But for the grace of God," I nodded. "Have you any grace for me?" I could hear a positively wicked smile in his voice this time. "Yes, sir." "I told you not to call me that, you tiny little pygmy." "Pygmy, am I? Well, at least a pygmy's a man. A jackass isn't much good for anything but pulling carts and siring mules." "You think you're so bright." "No, sir, I think you're the bright one. It's not every day one comes upon a talking ass." For all the ease of our joking, I came away from that meeting more sober in thought than I have ever been. If Henry is right, and there is war in our lifetime. But I do not wish to dwell on such sad reckonings. I feel ill now thinking of which way I must turn if the time comes. How much worse must I feel when these musings become reality?